What's up? I'm Steven Rosignol, and I'm gonna talk about my criminal justice practitioner interview. I chose my friend Jake. Jake and I actually know each other from other life stuff. Full disclosure, I was never really one for the criminal justice field. I was actually kind of against it for a long time. So this assignment was a little tedious for me. But Jake is actually a reserve police officer for the Bangor Police Department. And I had just gotten in contact with him because I knew he wanted to become a police officer. And I was like, hey man, do you mind if I ask you some questions and just kind of see what it's like to be a cop? Because I've never really had an interest in being a police officer, but do you mind if I ask, like, what made you want to do this? And it actually ended up being incredibly informative. So for that, I'm definitely grateful. And yeah, let's go into this. So, like I said, Jake, he works for the Bangor Police Department as a reserve police officer. Um, that being said, before I get into why, or excuse me, what the difference between a police officer and a reserve police officer is, because I was like, what's the difference? I decided to ask him about his background. Like I said, I wanted to know what got him into the criminal justice field. So he told me at his high school, they had a forensic science class, and they had these lab pigs in these fields that had the pigs were deceased, and they put them in different environments. Like they buried one, and they had shade over another one, and like just stuff like of that nature. And they would go out there after a few days, and the teacher would be like, "All right, like do you notice the differences in decomposition between this pig versus this pig in a different environment?" And I was just fascinated because I was like, that didn't happen at high school for me. And so I was like, did you go to school around Detroit? And ironically, he said, yes, he did. So that was really cool. He told me that a really big mentor for him was actually, I believe he said it was like a neighbor, but it was a former homicide detective named Brian Dewan, and he worked for the Detroit Police Department. And so he gave him a lot of advice. Jake ended up going to Grand Valley to pursue his education. He eventually got to work for the Grand Valley Police Department, but it was more like entry level, doing parking tickets and stuff like that. Um, but that was like his first like big job, and he was promoted to cadet, which is just more. It's like a fancy way of saying a parking supervisor, is how he described it to me. So I thought that was really cool to learn about that. But I was interested because it seems to me like here he's like kind of dabbling with it, and so I'm like, all right, like let's figure out some other stuff here. When around the time I met Jake, he had talked about working at the JW a lot, Marriott right downtown. He was actually a security officer there, and he said that that was his first like, criminal justice esque job, which is to me was kind of funny because Grant he worked for the GVPD, but I don't know. That's either here nor there. Anyway, so he claims that later on, which we'll get to in a moment here, but his time at Grand Valley really helped him focus on like the procedural aspect of criminal justice looking back, and that his work at the JW as security really helped him with like his people and like kind of more street smarts, because he said he had to deal with a lot of like inebriated homeless people on the streets, or guests coming in intoxicated and dealing with that. It was more like real life. Like Grand Valley, it was just like you're writing parking tickets and learning that structure of how to file stuff. So I thought that was really useful information. Um, when the pandemic hit, the hotel shut down. So he became dispatched for a private security company and also did silent observer there. Um, and then he went to work for the veterans home. So, and all this happened actually while I knew him. I met him right before the pandemic. So, the veterans home allowed him to implement a lot of his past experience at his jobs. He said that while he worked there, between 30 to 40% of the residents died. Um, they had to implement security cameras for and try to figure out points of contact between, when somebody, like, say, like a guy like grabbed something and he had contact with somebody that had contracted COVID-19 earlier. um he had to, like, kind of like go through security footage and try to piece a lot of stuff together, which I thought was actually really cool and fascinating. I would have never thought to have done that myself in a million years, but I thought that was incredibly informational. But unfortunately, there were a lot of deaths. He's, as I said, 30 to 40% of residents passed away, and he said he was looking at like 3 bodies a day when it was getting really bad. Um, so he really honed his investigative skills, is what he told me. Um, he did a lot of like video autopsies, like trying to trace things back, figure out when they started getting sick, and just trying to really piece the puzzle together. Yeah. Uh, from there, I kind of was like, all right, so all this is going on. What's your next big thing that happened? And while he was doing all of that, uh, it was 4th of July, like right around there. His roommate at the time, it's, I believe currently, is a Bangor police officer. And this is right after the pier shooting. I just want to note this. Everybody heard about it this summer in South Haven. For those of you that might be watching this, I'm not sure if it's just my professor or not, but in South Haven they had a very, very rare shooting incident on the pier. So that was kind of a scary time to be a police officer out there. Um, but yeah, so his first ride along was the 4th of July, and I asked him, I was like, so how did this happen? Because as somebody that's not at all familiar with law enforcement, I just wanted to know. So he told me it's called a civilian ride along, which is open to the public. And I was like, so how did it feel? He was like, it felt awesome and it felt right and it felt comfortable, which I think is important for him, seeing how it's what he's going into. Um, so from there, after we talked about, like, I probed him for some information as far as how somebody can get involved when it comes to, like, seeing what the police do. So obviously the ride along was his first cue. He also had brought up, like, just talking to officers, which, generally is a good idea if you want to know something. Um, but then we got into the Reserve Police Department, and I was like, how do you become a reserve officer? And I got it all listed here from our interview. It's called the MCOLS. It's an accreditation that isn't required for it. But he said he just filled out a paper application similar to any job app. And he interviewed with the deputy chief of police, just because that's who he was able to get through to. And one really important thing Jake wanted me to mention was the interview process. It's less of a sales pitch and more of an autobiography. They know everything about you. There's really not a whole lot you can hide there with the police. They're trained lie detectors. So one thing I thought was really interesting was how they press you on answers. He said that it's similar to being cross-examined, or like what you see on crime shows. You just, elaborate even further than what those people would. They talked a lot about scenarios, like open-ended questions, and they just kind of like let them talk, and then they would talk about the responses. And he told me he was hired on the spot, which I was, very happy to see my friend have that happen. They gave him a uniform, and so I inquired about, you see like downtown Grand Rapids police officers, their get-ups. I know that I personally, at least like just a month ago, pulled up next to the SWAT van, which is really intimidating. But I was like, what does a reserve police officer get? He told me you get a uniform, you get armor like a bulletproof vest, handcuffs, of course, a badge with his nameplate, on it. He got a Glock 17 for a primary weapon, and then a Smith & Wesson 357, which I've actually shot one of those before. They're a lot of fun to shoot, at least I thought. So I thought that was really cool. That's a secondary weapon. He said that's more for like animal conflict. Hate to put it this way, but could be dogs. He said that there's a lot of dogs in the area, but it could be anything. Like, what if there were a bear or any type of like wild rabid animal? I mean, they've had bears on the west side of Grand Rapids. I assume they have them in Bangor once in a great while, at least, maybe. Anyway, so I asked him what the role of a reserve officer is, because if you're not full-fledged, then what exactly do you do? At this point, I'm like, okay, you have all this really cool stuff, like, so what roles do you have? He said typically you're riding shotgun. The full officer's got the keys, he's doing the driving, and you're just general support for the full-time officers. He said that reserve officers are really great for traffic stops, which I guess makes sense. I just didn't really think about it. He said that they tend to stand there with they have like this flashlight on their shoulder, and you can just peer right into the vehicle, or like not peer, but like keep a light on the vehicle. That way, when the main officer goes back and runs the information, it's just another set of eyes making sure nothing crazy happens. Which, hey, like, if I were in that situation, like, that would give me some security and comfort. I don't want some guy to turn around and shoot me. So, right on. I asked them what type of calls they get. So during the day, like 80 to 85% are school related. The elementary, junior, and high school are all like in close proximity. I asked him a lot about the nature of the calls, and he said that there's discussions about a possible school resource officer, which I remember having one of those when I was in high school, so I understood the gist of that. I thought it was interesting, though, that like the school pays the police department to basically contract an officer for it, which I didn't realize it was just to me, because that's all I've ever known personally. So I guess I was ignorant there. I didn't really think about smaller communities and how some of them might not have a resource officer, and some smaller schools just get by without that, which to me was just, I don't know, like a lot of this I've said today, I just had no idea. So I asked him about what goes on at nights, and he said it's self-initiated traffic stops, like speeding, people in the wrong lane. Yeah, besides that, I asked him what life is like between the departments and their rapport with one another. And he said it's fluid, it changes over time. It's a little bit like what you see on TV is the gist that I personally got from it. Some departments might not like other departments, but that changes over time as people, switch departments or move to different positions. He said it stays really fluid, so, which I would say as is life, really. I asked him, how does one go from a reserve police officer to a full-fledged officer after discussing all this? And he said, there's the common way, which is somebody pays to go to the police academy as a private citizen, and that doesn't automatically make you a police officer. It just makes you certifiable. And he made that very clear. It's only when you get hired by a department that you are considered a police officer. So, which I had no idea any of that was a thing. But and then he said there was another way, which is actually really rare. You can get sponsored by the police department. It's where you don't interview for the academy, you interview for the job. And he said it's best to do this as a cadet or a reserve police officer, which he is. And they pay you to go to the academy based on a contract for employment. They have to hire you. It's a conditional offer. It's like no different than, say, a truck driver or somebody works for a company and the company needs truck drivers and they'll offer to train you to do it, but you have to sign something that states that you'll work with them. I just work in transportation, so that's the best example I can come up with. Yeah, so that being said, um, talking about him becoming a full-fledged police officer, I asked him, if that was his intentions. He said absolutely, of course. Um, so I asked him what he kind of looked forward to with that, and tried to, really build some empathy there. And he said he really likes the one town, one story aspect of Bangor. Everything's like related and connected to the point where it feels like a TV show, like The Office. Which, full disclosure here, I'm a deliver. I just became a delivery supervisor, so that's cool. But I was a delivery driver. I used to deliver there until last week, so I'm very familiar with the area and what it's like there. It's like very desolate. There's not a whole lot going on in Bangor, Michigan. Um, it's a cute, quiet, quaint town, and he said it feels like a TV show, like The Office, and like everybody that is on the police force, excuse me, like has a job within the town on top of it. So everything's just like really connected, and people really, go out of their way to help one another. And I could really tell that Jake wanted that in a certain sense. Um, I'm just going over my notes here. I asked him what his least favorite thing about the idea of it was, and he just said that there's no tank because he'd rather have one and need one than not have one at all. So, of course, he is a bit of a smartass with me sometimes, but we've always had that kind of going on. Um, but then, of course, I got serious. I was like, what would you really like to see happen? And he said that he'd like to see the building get upgraded, which I think is really noble. It shows me, at least as an interviewer, that Jake really, really not only wants this, but he wants to take a lot of pride in it, and be able to talk about what he does, and show people like this is where I do my job. And to me, that really spoke volumes. Yeah, so he also had. I also asked him if there was anything else he wanted to know, and he said it's not a field you can do by yourself. You need to build relationships and connections, and you need to network. And basically, like, he didn't say that, but that's how I would put it. Is that you basically like need to network and just build empathy. Like, you need to earn that trust for that badge and that gun, instead of just having it handed to you, and just being told to go do something. He's like, there's so much more to it than that. And I think, if I may say this, that's something that's lost a lot these days, especially as me myself, full disclosure, just not being a big fan of police in general. Um, I think part of that does have to do with the media, as far as how policing is portrayed. I feel like, especially after this interview, I've had a really wrong idea of how it works. Or maybe it just works differently. I feel like in the city, these guys just go to the academy, they're given a badge and a gun, and next thing you know, they're killing minorities, or, just not doing a good job. There's not a lot of police trust right now. And, and part of that's a little bit of my bias. And that's why I wanted to do this interview, is kind of learn some stuff. And to be honest with you guys, I learned an awful lot. Um, One thing that Jake said that really stuck with me is he feels that the police department should be the fabric that holds the town together. And I think, it kind of goes back to nobility. I think he's going to be really good at this job. I think I not only got the information I wanted from this interview, as far as what it takes to be a reserve and then a full-fledged police officer, but I, I feel like I got a lot more of a look into a profession that I just never really understood. And now that I've taken the time to understand it, my feelings have definitely been changed. And I think that's cool. I think that honestly, I hope it gives people hope, because there's so much fighting right now. And I think if people just took a time to breathe and maybe get to know one another and figure out what's going on, we might not maybe shout as loud. So, thank you.